There are moments when we play and sing together that I'm just like, wow, I could go home. That was awesome. That was one of those moments. Not because we are that good, because if you would hear us at practice. And even sometimes when it comes to church, it doesn't go the way we think it will. But it's why what we do at Cornerstone is never performance-based. Because we often assume that life is performance-based and God will only be pleased with us when we do well, when we get everything right. The reality is that God is pleased with us when we choose to love Him. Whether we do it perfectly or we don't. That is what truly brings joy to God's heart. When we say, with all that I am, with all that I have, I will praise you. I love you, God. It's actually a great lead-in to our story, to our text this morning. I say story because we're reading the parable of the sower. If you have your Bibles, we're going to be looking in Matthew chapter 13. So if you want to grab your Bibles or pull your phones out, I will truly believe that you are reading a Bible app and looking and not playing on Facebook or texting. However, I will tell you with the timestamp, if we are Facebook friends, I may know if you were posting during church. Mine is showing me his, just so that I know. We're in Matthew chapter 13. It's the parable of the sower, a parable that I think many of us know well. And I love to talk about parables that we know well, because we start with a common knowledge. We start with more of an even knowledge base, but that also brings a challenge, because when we know something, the temptation is to say, I've heard this sermon before, I've read this text before, I am good, I'm going to check out for the next few minutes. Everyone will think that I'm paying attention, but I'm really not going to be. And I'm going to look like it, and I'm going to keep the Bible app there so that it looks like that's what I'm really doing, but I'm really not paying attention. I would encourage you that when we read passages that we know or we don't know, to really pay attention and to allow God to speak and to minister to you in this moment, because so often as we read the scriptures, we glean new things. Things that we didn't hear before, things that we missed before. And I don't know if that's ever happened to you. I've read a passage perhaps hundreds of times, come back to it and read it again and say, how did I miss that? That is really the Holy Spirit at work. And we talked about the Spirit a few weeks ago. That's one of the ways that the Spirit, I think, continues to bless us and to help us to grow, is showing us new things along the way. So don't go on to autopilot and say, I got this, I'm good for a while. Pastor Jamey talked about something I don't know. I want to preface this with, what is a parable? Well, we hear that word, we know that word if you're connected with the church in any way, but a parable is really a way of teaching or sharing that conceals and reveals. It's kind of like this enigmatic kind of formula where some people understand, some people don't understand, and maybe you can't explain everything fully, but when you get it, you get it. And sometimes if you have to, I don't know if you guys have ever had to explain a joke. Allie and Alex are at this phase where they're really trying hard to understand all of my jokes. And I know that my sense of humor is a little special. I think it's funny. I laugh at my own jokes. Some of you laugh at my jokes. Some of you laugh out of courtesy. I will take it either way. But there are times that I've had to explain my jokes to my children, and although they say they got it, you know they don't. And it's great and wonderful that they're trying, but it kind of went right over their heads. That's a bit of a challenge of a parable, because when we begin to explain it, we can't explain every little nuance of it and why certain parts of it mean this or to that. But it's a parable conceals and reveals, but it's also used to tease the person into discovering and thinking about the meaning. It gets their curiosity going. Have you ever heard a joke that you didn't quite get and it stuck with you for a while because you're trying to understand it? Same thing with a parable. Just because we preach about this or talk about it this morning, don't walk away and say, well, that one's solved. Let it continue to work. Let it continue to entice you into engagement with it throughout this week. Because that's the beauty of parables. And Matthew chapter 13 is all parables. 7 or 8, depending upon how you break it down. And so we're looking at one of the parables that actually begins everything. And the placement of these parables, we have an entire chapter of parables in chapter 13. And the placement of that is obviously right after chapter 12 and chapter 11. But do you know what's going on in chapters 11 and 12? Jesus really begins to experience some rejection. Not just from the religious elite, but from the towns and some of the cities and from people that he's meeting. And so chapters 11 and 12, Jesus is actually experiencing a lot of rejection. A lot of people saying, we are not interested in what you are saying. We don't care who you are. Now, we don't think much about that. We tend to think of the opposition that Jesus encountered were just from the religious leaders. But 11 and 12 are telling us that regular people were rejecting him too. And in chapter 11, verse 20, there is this section titled as Woe to Unrepentant Towns. These major towns that just said to Jesus, we want nothing to do with you. And so it's this reminder that right off the bat, as you're coming into this, if you were to have read the Gospel of Matthew from start to finish, at this point, oh, Jesus is responding to all of these people who have said, we want nothing to do with you. And he's responding to people who also want something to do with him. And trying to explain how both of these work. And so these parables in chapter 13 are concerned with two primary topics. And this is going to be the heart of what we deal with in our passage this morning. First, God's activity. Every parable in chapter 13 deals with God's activity in the present. And that is something that we talk about now. I fully believe that God is present and active in our world right now. And as we are watching and paying attention, we can see God at work. And if you're not seeing that, what I would begin to do is to encourage you to pray, God, help me to see you at work in the everyday, in the commonplace, in the ways that you are at work behind the scenes that I don't always see. But these parables are concerned with God's activity. And then secondly, they're concerned with the people's response. Every one of these parables have those two things in theme. They show us what God is doing, and then they show us how people are responding. That's honestly what we deal with today, right? What do we see God doing? And how do people respond? How do I choose to respond? Where am I with God in this moment? So they're concerned with these. And so I want you to hear this as we read Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. Listen for God's activity. Listen for the people's activity. And let it pull you into the dialogue. That same day, Jesus went out to the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no roots. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Verse 9, he who has ears, let him hear. I've heard this passage preached on many times. And not just in preaching, but in talking with people. I've referred to as many times as lining up the people with the different types of soil. And there's some things that begin to happen in that. There are the four kinds of soil. We have the path, and the path is described as what? Pretty hard, right? Because if we begin to walk on a path, what happens? We pack it down. This is going to sound a little shallow, but I try to watch throughout the summer that I don't take the same paths through my yardway, because it begins to press it down. And then the grass isn't growing. I know that sounds horrible, doesn't it? My wife's shaking her head saying, I have no idea about that. I'm telling you, I truly do. I try to watch, because if we walk in the same spot, it will begin to make ruts. We'll begin to pat it down. I even mow my grass in different ways so that the tires on the mower don't just make all these ruts, because When a path occurs, the ground is pressed down in, and it makes it harder for stuff to grow. And that's the same thing that's happening here. So we have this farmer going along, and the first type of ground that we're talking about is the path, ground that has been walked on. It's not ground that's bad. It's ground that has been walked on, and it's tough. It has a really solid exterior, so that as you walk along, it works really well. There are places in my yard that even right now, with all the rain that we've had, I don't want to walk. It wouldn't make a good path because it's filled with water. And if I make a few trips across there, guess what I'm going to have instead of water? I'm going to have mud. And it's deep. It actually gets deep enough and soft enough that you can get stuck. Gotten the mower stuck. I know how deep it gets. There's a lot of mud there. And so this path is not just bad, but it's firm. It's been packed down, and so when the seed falls there, it's very difficult for anything to grow. The second are the rocky places with little soil. And what happens is stuff springs up quickly and then it dies. Several years ago, I had a grand idea of planting a garden. This romantic, nostalgic idea of how wonderful it would be to plant a garden. I talked to Jesse, said, hey Jesse, would you bring the Kubota over? I want to make a garden, we'll dig it up, it'll be wonderful. And in my mind's eye, I had this picture of a beautiful, perfectly manicured garden. That first year, I did a great job of getting the ground broke up. Jesse worked with the tractor, I worked with the rototiller. I had blisters on my hands showing that I was working, and I might have even shown them to some of you, look what I was doing in my garden. What I may not have told you is I bought wonderful plants, and my wife finally got to the point that she planted the plants because I hadn't, and they were dying in the containers we had bought them. And as she planted it, she's like, I thought you were going to do this. I said, so did I. But as I worked in that garden, and I did spend some time in that garden, do you know what I found throughout my garden? Rocks. I found a lot of rocks in my garden. And it seemed the more that I worked, the more rocks I found. I had no idea there were that many rocks in my garden. And rocks, as we know, make it very difficult for some of these things to grow. And so that some of the seed is scattered amongst rocky places where it's very difficult for anything to grow. And it grows quickly, but then it dies. The third is the thorny ground. And what happens here is it begins to take root, but it's choked out by the thorns, choked out by the weeds. And I can tell you what a garden looks like when it is choked out by weeds. There's a lot of stuff growing, but not the stuff you're hoping for. And finally, we get to the good soil. We get to the soil that in my eyes, it is lush. There's moisture in it. When you pick it up, you can get that good dirt smell. And some of the seed is scattered right into that. And we look at this and say, why would the farmer waste time with any area but the good soil? Right? Because when I was planting green beans, and I was planting tomatoes, and I was planting zucchini, now zucchini will grow anywhere.
Yeah.
And even though my garden is no longer, I still have zucchini growing. Why would the farmer waste time? Because when I was planting all those things, I went to the ground that I had worked on. I went to the soil that had been turned up, that was prepared, that was fresh, that I had put fertilizer in, that I had spent time removing rocks, removing grass, removing all the problems. I didn't throw it in my driveway. I didn't throw it amongst the rocks. I didn't throw it, intentionally into the weeds. I put it in the good soil. In fact, I did my best for most of us to dig a little trench and to place those seeds one by one right into the garden. Anybody else plant that way? Now, it may not have come out quite that way. My wife might have a little different version. But I'm telling you, at least up here, that's what I did. That was at least my intent. But there's a couple problems with this. When we begin to equate people with soil, we begin to look at people as though, oh, well, you're good soil, well, you are rocky soil, well, you are path soil, well, you are soil with thorns in it. You're soiled with weeds. There's a beginning of a problem. The first is that when we understand this parable this way, we make a couple assumptions. Number one, the first is that I'm automatically good soil. That's one of the first assumptions that we make. That I am the good soil. I am the soil where stuff was planted, and God planted the gospel with me, and I have grown and flourished. Look how wonderful I am. Now some of you are saying, I would never do that, but I have met many of us, including myself, who would say, I clearly am the good soil, because look at how I've grown. And so it starts to create this hierarchy of what is good and bad. And it leaves us in a really good spot. There's another problem with, or a really bad spot, there's another problem with this. Is if we have had difficult experiences in our life, or if we have struggled in our spiritual walk, we begin to assume that we are not the good soil. That there's challenges and problems in our life that really haven't been good, and we're not nearly as lucky as some of the other people. Because we look at the good soil and say, that soil is lucky. It was right. It was ripe for the gospel to be planted. It wasn't hard like the path. It wasn't full of rocks. It wasn't full of weeds. In fact, that good soil has had almost no problems. Look how well they're doing. It leaves us with the impression that the good soil never struggled. Now, when we think about this in church, we come into church and so often we put on our smiles and we put on our nice clothes and we laugh and act like everything's going well. Because when we come into church where we're with other Christians, we want them to think that things are going well. I'm always doing my best to be transparent with you. Our neighbor had their graduation party yesterday, and we watched this little girl, grow up from, she was about 8 years old when we moved in, and I can't believe that she has graduated high school already. And I knew that they were having their graduation party yesterday on the 8th, and I felt pressure to get some stuff cleaned up around the house that I had let go. Some projects that I had started that hadn't finished. Some weeding that needed to be done that I clearly hadn't done. And then a little bit of panic set in because I thought, oh no, all of these people who I don't know and will probably never see again are going to be at this graduation party, and they're going to look down the yard at my house and start to see all the problems that are going on there. And there was this fear that set in there. There is that fear that occurs within us when we walk into church and we say, if I don't look like I have it all together, then people are going to think less of me. That's part of the challenge with just assuming that we are the good soil. Because it gives us this impression that the good soil never struggled, that there was never a problem. That the good soil was simply fortunate to not have all of these things. And if I've had problems, then there's no hope for this to grow in me. Does that make sense? It's a little different perspective on this. If I wasn't at the right place at the right time, then things are going to be really difficult for me. The second challenge with just making the soil people is that it has caused the church, and this is a huge problem for me, it has caused the church to become very stingy with the seed that we are to sow. What is the seed that we are to sow as the church? Yeah, we're supposed to share Jesus, right? We're supposed to share the gospel, the good news. Whatever you want to say, however you want to title it, we are supposed to share what Jesus did, what Jesus has done in our life with everyone around us. We call it evangelism, right? And so it has made us start to size people up when we look at them and say, well, before I go and invest, I want to make sure that my efforts are really rewarded. And I only want to share the gospel with people that I think are good soil potential. So if they look like they've been trampled down into a path, and there's not much of a hope for the seeds to grow there, we don't spend any time. If they look like they have a lot of weeds in their life that's probably going to choke it out, we don't spend any time. And if it looks like, that's rocky ground was the third one. If it looks like they're rocky ground and it's really not going to be able to take root, we don't spend much time, and we spend all of our efforts going for people that we deem as good soil. And writing off 3/4 of the space that we could be planting seed. Is that how the farmer acted? And from the parable, do we get any inkling that the farmer is upset that seed has been spread on the path? Do we get an inkling that the farmer is upset that seed has been sown amongst the rocks? Or amongst the thorns? No. The farmer is content to sow seed anywhere the farmer walks. It's almost this picture that there's a hole in the farmer's bag. And no matter where he goes, no matter what kind of soil he comes in contact with, there is just this seed, this gospel coming out wherever he goes. He's not just looking and saying, well, I've got a handful left. I want to make sure that it plants well, that it's successful. I'm going to save it until I get to good soil, and that's where I'm going to invest it all. No, it's this idea that the farmer has so much seed in his bag, so much to plant, that anywhere he goes, it's just spilling out and flowing anywhere that it could happen. So whether it's the path, whether it's the rocky ground, whether it's a ground with weeds, or it's good soil, it's still worthy of receiving some of that seed. It is sinful to look at people and say there is no hope for you. You are too far gone for the gospel.
That's right.
We don't ever think about that. We think of sin as the things that we do. We tend to line those up as drinking, drugs, alcohol, sex, pornography. In my church, it was going to movies, especially rated R movies. So if you did that stuff, you went to the next town where it wasn't so bad. But all of these things that we tend to list as sinful, I am telling you, if we are the ones, the bearers of the gospel, and we are looking at people saying, well, you're not really worth investing in because I don't think it's going to grow, and you're not worth it because it's not going to grow, and you're not worth it because it's going to grow, but you are, because that is sinful. As we read the Gospels, the overall message that we continue to come back with, Jesus has asked, what's the most important commandment? What is it? Love the Lord your God with your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength. Luke actually says all four. Love God with all that you are. And the second that's attached right to it, with not a comma, but an and, conjunction, it continues on. And love your neighbor as yourself. There is no distinction as to who our neighbor is then. It is everybody around us. And they did actually try to get through this with the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's everyone we come in contact with. And so I want you to begin to think of yourself as a farmer, not charged with a little bit of precious seed, but given an abundance of seed, a never-ending supply, and knowing that you can begin to share that anywhere you go. Imagine how much we would change and how much the world would be changed if we walked around spreading the gospel every place we went. Most of us wait. We expect the church to create opportunities for us to share the gospel. And we try to do some of that. And then we pounce because we've been saved and we've been waiting and we know that we're supposed to do this. But imagine if you didn't have to wait for the church to create that. You don't. You don't have to wait for that. There's a third challenge to just equating people with types of soil and writing people off, is that we miss an older teaching of the church. And this is something that I think is truly remarkable, and it reminds us that the gospel is just much more than what we share or what we do or what we say, that there truly is a divine connection when the gospel is shared. Even though the results look meager, God produces a miraculous harvest of this. if you look at the story of this parable, it seems as though 75% of the seed fell in places that it wasn't going to grow. And yet, when the seed fell in that good soil, it produced 160 or 30 times what was sown. Now the way this worked is a basket of seed, a really good, like everyone would be thrilled harvest, is that one bushel of seed would produce 10 bushels of grain. That was amazing. If you got a tenfold response, you were doing really, really well, because average was about 7.5. So think about that. You get 7.5 on average. 10 is good. But some of this seed is falling into good soil, which produces 160 or 30 times what was sown. So it's at minimum 3 times better than what we would consider an amazing, miraculous harvest. And so this third challenge points out that even though the results look meager, God does miracles. Now that is absolutely consistent with what we read of Jesus doing miracles with feeding of the 5,000, with the miraculous catch of the fish in the sea when there was nothing on the other side of the boat. That God can produce miraculous things from what we deem as completely empty or void or meager. It's awesome, isn't it?
Yes.
And you see why I'm beginning to challenge this idea that we can look at people and say, well, you're this kind of soil, 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 here's where I'll invest. Because when we do that, we're assuming that it's all on us, and we're missing God's involvement.
That's right.
We fail to miss the fact that God is the one who is really producing this harvest. That God is the one really doing the harvest one. And that God is the only one who truly knows all the results. Over the years, I've been blessed with a couple of opportunities where people have come back to me and said, did you know I became a Christian? I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea. And it was just a moment where I remembered. It's not just about me. It's not just about what I do and how I do this stuff. Because I had no idea what they were doing with it. I didn't even know that they were listening. Because in my eyes, I had written them off as one of those 3 that didn't produce anything. In fact, they weren't even falling into the rocky soils. They weren't springing up quick. They were one of the 2. They were the path where the seed, where it looked like the birds ate it. And it was this amazing reminder that God can do stuff even when I'm not seeing it. So what do we do with this passage? What do we do with this? We can't look at it and say, well, you're this kind of soil or that kind of soil, and then choose how we interact with people. What do we do with it? The first is that we do not write ourselves off because we struggle spiritually. Every person I know who is in the faith has struggled. If you haven't struggled, we need to talk. I need your secret. Because I'm going to tell you that I have struggled. But every person who I know who's a serious follower of Jesus has struggled in some capacity. And so what do we do with it? We don't write ourselves up and say, well, I'm just a poor kind of soil because I've struggled. I'm not the good soil. In fact, there's not much hope for me. That's not it at all. So we don't write ourselves off because we struggle. The second is we begin to do something that David writes a lot about in the Psalms. We pray for understanding. We pray for wisdom. We pray that God would begin to reveal to us His truths, to help us to understand, to help us to grow, to help let His gospel really take root in our life and to grow to something that we could not produce on our own. And that's part of this conceal, reveal part of the parable. As much as it is something that we can be teased into, it is also dependent upon God revealing the meaning to us. And so we pray that God would be at work within our hearts and lives and to really help His gospel to take effect and to change who we are on a daily basis. And as that happens, that is a continual marathon race. It's not a sprint. It's not I show up, I do this a little bit, and I'm done. It is a lifelong endeavor. It prepares us for the third step, which in the third step, guess what we're going to do? No guesses. Everybody's afraid. We're going out as the farmer to sow seed. We're going out with a bag full of gospel seeds, not that we have purchased, but that God has provided for us. And no matter how many we give out or throw out to the ground, guess what happens? The bag remains full. It's a bag that's never going to empty. No matter how many holes we punch in the bag, no matter how many handfuls we throw out, no matter where it goes, as long as we are continuing to grow with God, our ability to share the gospel never ends. Some of you are starting to say, this sounds like work. It is. When we think of farmers, we think of people who work hard. Who work really hard at certain times of the year, but work that never ends. And if you're a farmer who has livestock, that is every day. There is no vacation from that. Because even if you go away and you have someone to watch the animals, if something goes wrong, guess what happens? You're coming right back. And so we go out to sow seed, understanding that we will never stop until the day that we begin to transition from heaven to, or from earth to heaven. That's the day it ends for us. In an ideal sermon world, I would have had little pouches for you, full of seed. But anything that I would hand you would be limited, right? Confined to a little packet, confined to a baggie. But the gospel seed that God has given us is unlimited. Which means you can sow it anywhere. And what's your challenge? To sow it everywhere. So let's pray. Dear God, thank you for this parable. Thank you for this farmer. Thank you for the farmers who gave to us when we could have easily been written off as path soil or rocky soil or thorny soil, whatever it is, God, anything but good. Thank you for men and women who cared so much about you and about us that they invested even though perhaps we were not the most likely to succeed or to produce your fruit. And we pray as we read this parable that it would continue to tease us into dialogue with you this week. That it would help us to continue to think about you and your work. And that God, that every time we see a field of corn, every time we see soybeans or a garden or flowers, that we would be reminded, oh yeah, I can plant seed as well. Gospel seeds. And that God, that you will be the one who produces the miraculous harvest, not us. God, we thank you for this day. Increase our understanding. Help us to see you more each and every day through everything that we do. And to be reminded that we are yours. And thank you for this day. It's in Jesus' name that we pray.